A home is not built with hands, but with silence. Please, sir, just for the boy. The wind was a thief on the plains, stealing the warmth from a person's bones and the words from their mouth. It scoured the dust-choked main street of Redemption, a town that offered little of its namesake. On a raised platform before the saloon, a woman stood with a child clutched to her side. Her name was Alara, though no one here knew it. To them, she was merely debt made flesh, a problem to be solved by the highest bidder. Her face was a mask of exhaustion, carved from hardship and sleepless nights, but her eyes, fixed on the man who controlled her fate, held a spark of unbroken will. He was a clerk, a man whose authority came not from strength or character, but from the ledger book he held in his pale, soft hands. Beside him stood Jedediah Thorne's enforcer, a hulking man with a sneer that seemed permanently etched onto his face. The auction was not for property or livestock, but for an indenture of marriage, a contract signed in desperation that had come due. From across the street, leaning against the shadowed wall of the smithy, Silas watched. He was a man who had made a home out of solitude, his borders defined by the reach of his land and the length of his memory. He had come to town for salt and flour, not for the spectacle of a woman's ruin. Yet he stayed, a silent observer drawn by a current he did not understand. He saw the way she shielded the small boy with her body, a fragile fortress against the leering eyes of the assembled men. He saw the tremor in her hands and the proud, straight line of her back. The clerk began his pitch, his voice thin and reedy against the persistent moan of the wind. A fine woman, hard-working and hale. Her debt to Mr. Thorne is considerable, but he is a generous man. He is willing to forgive it in exchange for a 5-year contract of marriage and service. An opportunity, gentlemen, to acquire a wife and settle a debt in one stroke. A few men shuffled their feet. One laughed, a low, cruel sound. Alara flinched, pulling her son, Leo, even closer. The boy buried his face in the folds of her worn skirt, his small shoulders shaking. "Let's see what we're bidding on," the enforcer grunted, stepping toward her. He reached for the boy. "Move the brat aside." That was the moment the world shifted. It was not a grand, theatrical gesture. It was small, sharp, and absolute. Alara's body went rigid. "No," she whispered, the word a stone thrown against a fortress wall. She wrapped her arms so tightly around her son that her knuckles went white. The enforcer's hand closed on her arm. "Don't make this difficult." Silas pushed off the wall. He did not run. He walked, his steps measured and deliberate, his worn boots making no sound in the thick dust. He crossed the street, moving through the small crowd as if they were ghosts. No one seemed to notice him until he was at the base of the platform. He didn't look at the clerk or the enforcer. His eyes were on the woman. He saw the terror in her face, but beneath it, the fierce, animalistic protection of a mother. It was a look he remembered, a look that had haunted the long, silent nights at his homestead for years. The memory was a sudden, sharp pain behind his ribs. He stopped it before it could take hold. He had work to do. He looked at the clerk. His voice, unused to speaking to more than a horse or the wind, was raspy but clear, cut through the murmuring. "What is the debt?" The clerk, startled, peered down at him. "That's not the arrangement. The contract is for marriage." "I didn't ask about the arrangement," Silas said, his tone flat, unchanging. "I asked for the number." The clerk licked his lips, glancing nervously at the enforcer. "It's $100, an exorbitant sum, meant to be impossible to pay. It was the price of a good horse, of a whole season's supplies. It was the price of a life." Silas reached into the pocket of his canvas coat. He pulled out a worn leather pouch, heavy with the profits of a cattle sale he had just made. He untied the drawstring and, without counting, poured a cascade of coins and worn bills onto the platform at the clerk's feet. The sound of the money hitting the wood was louder than a gunshot. It was more than $100. It was everything he had. A collective gasp went through the crowd. The clerk stared, his mouth agape. Silas looked past him at Alara. Her eyes were wide, filled with a disbelief so profound it bordered on fear. He gave a short, almost imperceptible nod. He had not offered her a job. He had not offered her shelter. He had offered her freedom, bought and paid for in the town square. He had done it without thinking, an impulse born from a memory of a time he had failed to act. He turned and walked away before anyone could speak, melting back into the shadows he came from. He did not know if she would follow. He did not know what he would do if she did. He only knew that the silence of his life had just been broken, and the echo was already chasing him home. She found him on the edge of town, where the last dusty buildings gave way to the endless, rolling plains. He was adjusting the cinch on his saddle, his movements economical and practiced. He did not seem surprised to see her. He had been waiting. Alara stood a few feet away, her son's small hand gripped tightly in hers. The money was clutched in her other hand, a heavy, impossible weight. She held it out to him. "I cannot take this." Silas finished with the cinch and turned to face her. His expression was unreadable, his face weathered by sun and sorrow. "It's not for you to take. The debt is paid." "This is a different kind of debt," she insisted, her voice trembling slightly. "One I can never repay." She was exhausted, wary, and deeply suspicious of kindness. Kindness always came with a price, and she had nothing left to give. He looked at her, then at the boy, who peered at him from behind his mother's skirt with wide, curious eyes. The wind whipped a strand of her dark hair across her face, and she pushed it away with a weary gesture. He saw the faint, bruised shadow of a handprint on her arm where the enforcer had grabbed her. "I have work," he said. It was not an offer of charity. It was a statement of fact. The homestead needs tending, fences to mend, a winter's worth of wood to chop. It's hard work. She hesitated, her mind racing. To stay in redemption was impossible. Thorne would find another way. To move on, with no money and a child, was a slow death sentence on the open plains. This man, this stranger, was offering a third option. An unknown. It was dangerous, but it was a choice. "Where?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He gestured with his head toward the vast, empty horizon. "A day's walk. My cabin is sturdy. There's a shed you can have." A shed, not a room in the house. The distinction was clear. He was offering employment, not welcome. He was setting a boundary, and in a strange way it reassured her, felt honest. She looked down at her son, at his tired face and the scuffs on his little boots. For him, she would swallow her pride. For him, she would accept the help of a silent stranger. "We can work," she said, her voice firmer now. She pushed the money back toward him. "This can be our wages, paid in advance. We will work until it's earned." Silas looked at the money in her hand, then back at her face. He saw the fierce pride there, the refusal to be a victim. He gave a slow nod. He took the money and tucked it back into his pouch. The transaction was complete. The walk was long and silent. Silas led the way on his horse, while Alara and Leo followed on foot. He had offered to let the boy ride, but Alara had quietly refused. They would not be a burden. They would walk. The landscape was monotonous and unending. A sea of brown grass under a vast, pale sky. Silas never looked back, but he was acutely aware of the two small figures trailing him, their pace steady, their endurance a quiet testament to their resilience. They arrived as dusk was bleeding purple and orange across the horizon. The homestead was just as he'd described it. A small, sturdy log cabin, a lean-to barn, and a corral. It was isolated, a lonely outpost against the immensity of the plains. It looked like the home of a man who preferred the company of the wind. He dismounted and led them not to the main cabin, but to the shed. It was little more than 4 walls and a roof, with a dirt floor and a single grime-covered window. The air inside was cold and smelled of damp earth and disuse. It was a bleak place, but it had a door that could be barred. It was a space of their own. Without a word, Silas went into his cabin. He returned a moment later with a lantern, 2 thick wool blankets, and a sack containing a loaf of bread, a wedge of cheese, and some dried apples. He set them just inside the shed's doorway. One of the blankets was a heavy, patchwork quilt, its colors faded from years of use. It looked old and cherished. "The well is over there," he said, pointing. "I'll leave firewood by the door in the morning." Alara watched him, her arms wrapped around herself. "Thank you," the words felt inadequate. He just nodded, his gaze lingering for a second on the boy, who was already huddled in one of the blankets. Then he turned and walked back to his cabin, the space between them stretching out in the gathering dark. He closed his door, and the light from his window was a solitary, yellow eye in the vast darkness. Alara barred the shed door. She spread the blankets on the floor, making a small nest for Leo. She gave him the bread and cheese, watching as he ate with the quiet hunger of a child who has known too little. She ate nothing herself. She sat in the darkness, listening to the sound of her son's breathing and the lonely cry of the wind. She was safe for now. But trust was a foreign country, and she had no map to find her way there. She had traded one cage for another, and she did not yet know if the new warden was any kinder than the last. The weight of the quilt felt heavy, like a debt she could feel in her hands. Days bled into one another, marked by the rising and setting of a relentless sun. A routine, spare and silent, began to weave itself into the fabric of their lives. Each morning, before the sky had lightened from bruised purple to pale gray, Silas would be gone, checking fence lines or tending to his few cattle. When Alara emerged from the shed, a neat stack of freshly chopped firewood would be waiting by the door. She never saw him leave it. It simply appeared, a quiet, daily provision. She worked with a fierce, determined energy, as if trying to outrun the debt she felt she owed. She mended the sections of fence he marked for her, her hands, already calloused, growing tougher. She cleared stones from the small patch of land behind the cabin that might one day become a garden. She drew water, cleaned the barn, and kept to her side of the unspoken line that divided the homestead. Leo was her shadow, a small, quiet boy who was slowly regaining the color in his cheeks. He would help her carry small branches or sit in the dirt, drawing patterns with a stick. He watched Silas from a distance with an unnerving stillness. He saw the big, quiet man moving with a purpose that was as steady as the turning of the earth. He saw him treat his horse with a gentle hand and a soft voice, a tenderness he never showed to people. Silas, in turn, was always aware of them. As he worked on the far side of the property, he would see her, a small figure bent over a fence post, her resilience a stark and lonely silhouette against the horizon. He saw the way she would stop her work to brush the hair from her son's face, a gesture of such profound love it made his own chest ache with a hollow, familiar pain. Their interactions were minimal, functional. A nod in the morning, a gesture toward a broken tool that needed fixing. Words were a currency they did not trade. Silence was the language of the homestead. It filled the spaces between the ring of the axe, the creak of the well pump, and the sigh of the wind. One afternoon, Silas was in his cabin, cleaning his rifle, the scent of oil and metal filling the small space. The cabin was obsessively neat, everything in its place. A single cot, a sturdy table with one chair, a stone hearth swept clean. It was a space designed for one, a fortress against intrusion. On the small mantelpiece above the hearth, there was only one object, a small bird, carved from a piece of pale pine wood. Its wings were half spread, as if caught in the moment before flight. He picked it up, his thumb tracing the smooth, worn lines. The wood was warm from the low fire. He closed his eyes, and the silence of the cabin was filled with the ghosts of other sounds. A woman's laughter, bright and clear as a river, and the high-pitched shriek of a child's delight. "Higher, Papa! Push me higher!" The memory was so vivid it felt like a physical blow. He remembered the feel of the small hands that had held this bird, the pride in the little voice that had called it his own. He had carved it for his own son, a boy with eyes the color of a summer sky, a boy who was gone, a wife who was gone, lost to a fever that had swept through their valley like a prairie fire, leaving nothing but scorched earth and silence in its wake. He had failed to protect them. The guilt was a constant companion, a shadow that clung to him even in the brightest sunlight. He had retreated into this self-imposed exile, believing he deserved the emptiness. He put the bird back on the mantle, its wings forever poised to fly. He had brought this woman and her child here, an act of pure, unthinking impulse. Now, their presence was a constant, quiet reminder of everything he had lost, and everything he was afraid to feel again. He looked out the window and saw Alara splitting kindling, her movements precise and strong. She was a survivor. He wondered, not for the first time, if he was too. He watched her one evening as she tried to soothe Leo, who had woken from a nightmare. She was rocking him gently, humming a tune so soft the wind almost carried it away. She was in the shed, and Silas stood in the deep shadow of his own cabin, an unseen observer. The light from her lantern cast their mingled shadows against the rough wood walls. He saw not just a woman and her child, but a universe of love and fear contained in that small, fragile space. He turned away and went back inside. The image burned into his mind. The silence in his cabin felt deeper, colder than ever before. It was no longer a comfort. It was a cage. The days grew shorter, the nights colder. The wind began to carry a new edge, a sharp, biting promise of the winter to come. Silas noticed things. He saw the way Alara shivered in her thin shawl as she worked. He saw the persistent, rattling cough that Leo was developing. He saw the cracks in the walls of the shed, places where the relentless wind could force its way in. He began to act in secret, a phantom caretaker. One afternoon, while Alara and Leo were on the other side of a low rise, gathering dried brush, he took his tools to the shed. The work was swift and silent. He chinked the gaps between the logs with a mixture of mud and dried grass, a skill he hadn't used in years. He found an old, cracked pane of glass in the barn and carefully fitted it into the shed's empty window frame, securing it with small nails and sealing the edges with tallow. He worked on the roof, replacing warped shingles and patching weak spots with tar. He did it all with a quiet urgency, his movements efficient and sure. When he was finished, he gathered his tools and slipped away, leaving no trace of his presence except for the repairs themselves. He watched from his own window as they returned, Leo's arms full of sticks, Alara carrying a larger bundle of branches on her back. He saw her stop at the door of the shed. She looked at the newly sealed walls, her head tilted. She touched the glass in the window, her fingers tracing its outline. She looked around the empty homestead, her gaze sweeping over the barn, the corral, and finally, resting on the front of his cabin. He stepped back from the window, his heart pounding in his chest like a trapped bird. She did not acknowledge the repairs. Not with a word, not with a nod. But something shifted between them, a subtle realignment of the invisible boundary that separated their lives. The next morning, when he came out to find his own stack of firewood neatly replenished, he knew she had understood. It was a silent conversation, an exchange of labor and gratitude that required no words. He began leaving extra food on the small porch of the shed. A jar of preserved peaches, a slab of bacon wrapped in cloth, a small sack of potatoes. He told himself it was practical. They needed to be strong to do the work. They needed to be healthy to survive the coming winter. But it was more than that. It was a quiet, clumsy way of caring, the only way he knew how. The sky began to change. The endless blue was replaced by a bruised, heavy gray that pressed down on the land. The wind no longer whispered. It howled, a mournful, predatory sound that rattled the door of the cabin and shook the new pane of glass in the shed. Silas tasted the air and knew what was coming. A blizzard was gathering its strength in the north, a great white beast preparing to descend upon the plains. He spent the day securing the homestead. He checked the barn, ensuring the animals were safe and had enough feed. He stacked the last of the chopped wood against the wall of his cabin, creating a formidable bulwark against the snow. He worked with a grim focus, the impending storm mirroring the disquiet in his own soul. He looked toward the shed. It was sturdier now, but he knew it was not enough. It was no match for the full fury of a prairie winter. He went to the door of the shed that evening, a violation of their unspoken rules. He knocked once, his knuckles loud against the wood. Alara opened the door a crack, her face pale in the lantern light. Leo was huddled behind her, his small face pinched with worry. "A storm is coming," Silas said, his voice low and gruff. "A bad one. You need to come to the cabin." She stared at him, her eyes wide with suspicion and fear. To enter his space, his sanctuary, felt like a dangerous crossing. The shed was theirs. It was cold and small, but it was safe in its own way. "We'll be fine," she said, her voice tight. "No, you won't," he replied, his patience wearing thin. The wind tore at his coat, trying to rip the words from his mouth. "The shed won't hold against this. Not for days. Think of the boy." Her gaze flickered down to her son, who had started to cough again, a dry, rattling sound that tore at her heart. She looked back at Silas, at his unyielding expression, and saw not a demand, but a lifeline. She gave a single, sharp nod. They gathered their few belongings, the blankets, a change of clothes, the small satchel of her personal things. As they stepped out into the maelstrom, the first flakes of snow, hard and sharp as pellets of ice, began to fall. The wind screamed around them, and Alara had to hold onto Leo with all her strength to keep him from being torn from her grasp. Silas led the way, his broad back a shield against the worst of the gale. They fought their way across the 10 yards that separated the shed from the cabin, a journey that felt like a mile. When he finally pushed open the cabin door and ushered them inside, the sudden silence and warmth were a shock to the senses. The door boomed shut behind them, sealing out the storm, and sealing them in. Together, the world outside vanished behind a wall of shrieking wind and swirling snow. Inside the cabin, the only sounds were the crackle of the fire in the hearth and the ragged sound of their own breathing. The space was small, intimate, and charged with a tension that was thicker than the air itself. Silas motioned for them to sit by the fire. Alara guided Leo to the hearth, unwrapping his coat and chafing his small, cold hands. The boy's cough worsened. By nightfall, it had settled deep in his chest, a harsh, barking sound that echoed in the small cabin. His skin was hot to the touch, his breathing shallow and rapid. A fever had taken hold, its roots deep in the chill he'd caught in the preceding weeks. Alara's fear was a cold, hard knot in her stomach. She held him on her lap, rocking him, humming the same soft tune she always did, but it brought no comfort. Silas watched them from the other side of the room. He saw the panic rising in her eyes, the desperate way she tried to soothe the boy. He saw his own history playing out again before him, a cruel and mocking echo. The fever, the labored breathing, the mother's helpless terror. It was all the same. This time he would not stand by and do nothing. He moved with a quiet purpose that broke through Alara's fear-induced paralysis. "Lay him on the bed," he said, his voice gentle but firm. She looked from the sick child to the man, her instinct to keep her son close warring with the desperate need for help. She saw something in his eyes, not pity, but a deep, knowing sorrow, an understanding. She trusted it. She carried Leo to Silas's cot and laid him down on the rough-spun blankets. Silas was already at work. He stoked the fire, adding logs until it blazed, filling the cabin with a dry, steady heat. He hung a kettle of water over the flames and went to a small wooden chest in the corner. He opened it, and the scent of dried herbs filled the air, yarrow, mint, and chamomile. He took a small handful of each and dropped them into a tin cup, pouring the boiling water over them to steep. He brought the steaming cup to the bedside. "It will help the fever," he explained. He dipped a clean rag into a bowl of cool water from the bucket by the door and began to bathe Leo's forehead. His hands, though large and calloused from years of hard labor, were surprisingly gentle. He moved with a practiced competence, his touch steady and reassuring. Alara stood by, a helpless spectator. She watched the silent, withdrawn man tend to her son with a tenderness she could never have imagined. He spoke to Leo in a low, soothing murmur, telling him to be still, that it would be all right. He coaxed the boy to take small sips of the herbal tea, his patience seemingly infinite. All through the long night, as the blizzard raged outside, Silas did not rest. He sat on a stool beside the cot, keeping vigil. He changed the cool cloths, offered more tea, and listened to the boy's troubled breathing. Alara, exhausted to her core, eventually sank into the single wooden chair by the fire, the one that sat opposite a small, empty rocker. She did not sleep. She watched. She watched him care for her son, and in his quiet, focused actions, she saw the ghost of another life. This was not the first time he had done this. The knowledge settled in her heart, not as a thought, but as a certainty. This man knew this particular kind of pain. He was not just tending to her son. He was battling a memory, fighting a war he had already lost once before. As the first pale, gray light of dawn filtered through the snow-caked window, she realized the wall of silence between them had crumbled, not with words, but with a shared vigil in the heart of the storm. She had let him in. As the storm outside began to lose its fury, so too did the fever inside the small boy. Leo's breathing eased, the heat receded from his skin, and he finally fell into a deep, peaceful sleep. The crisis had passed. The silence that returned to the cabin was different now, softer, layered with the echoes of the long night's shared fear and quiet labor. Silas stood and stretched, his joints stiff from the long vigil. He added another log to the fire, the flames flaring up to cast a warm, golden light on the room. Alara had not moved from the chair. Her eyes were heavy with exhaustion, but she was watching him. He poured 2 cups of coffee from the pot that had been simmering on the hearth all night and handed one to her. Their fingers brushed as she took the warm tin cup. It was a fleeting, accidental touch, but it sent a jolt through both of them. It was the first time their skin had met. She cradled the cup in her hands, letting the warmth seep into her cold fingers. She looked at her son, sleeping soundly on the cot, his chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. "Thank you," she said, her voice husky with unshed tears. Silas just nodded, taking a seat on the stool by the fire. He stared into the flames, his shoulders slumped with a weariness that was more than just physical. The quiet stretched between them, no longer a barrier but a space for contemplation. It was Alara who broke it. "He had a sickness like this once before," she said, her voice so low it was almost lost to the crackle of the fire. "When he was a baby. His father. He didn't know what to do," she trailed off, the words hanging in the air, heavy with all the things she left unsaid. The implication was clear. His father was gone, and his absence was tied to a moment of helplessness. Silas continued to stare into the fire, his profile rigid. After a long moment, he spoke, his own voice rough with disuse. "My wife, Sarah. She was good with fevers." He said the name as if it were a fragile, precious thing he had not held in a long time. The simple, past-tense statement confirmed everything Alara had suspected during the night. It explained the herbs, the gentle hands, the deep, knowing sadness in his eyes. He gestured with his cup toward the empty wooden rocking chair that sat near the hearth. That was hers. She liked the rhythm of it, said it helped her think. Impulsively, Alara stood up from the hardback chair and moved to the rocker. She sat down, her slight weight causing the old wood to creak a soft, rhythmic protest. The motion was soothing, a gentle back and forth that seemed to rock the very stillness of the room. She could almost imagine another woman sitting here, in this same spot, watching the same fire. They did not share their full stories. There were no long confessions, no detailed histories of their pain. They simply exchanged fragments, small, broken pieces of their pasts offered up like peace offerings. He learned she was a widow, left with nothing but her husband's debt to a cruel man. She learned he was a widower, left with nothing but a homestead full of ghosts. The storm outside finally broke, revealing a world transformed, buried under a thick, pristine blanket of white. The sun, when it appeared, was dazzlingly bright on the new snow. But the change inside the cabin was even more profound. The unspoken line that had divided the homestead had been erased. When Leo finally woke, weak but clear-eyed, Silas was the one who carried him to the chair by the fire and fed him spoonfuls of thin, warm broth. They did not speak of what would happen next. There was no need. When Alara gathered her things, it was not to move them back to the shed. It was to find a small corner in the cabin to call her own. The shed was now just a place to store wood. The cabin, which for years had been a monument to one man's grief, was slowly, tentatively, beginning to feel like a home for three. The silence was still there, but it was no longer empty. It was filled with the quiet hum of a shared existence. Weeks turned into a month, and the deep snows of winter began their slow retreat, surrendering the land back to the brown earth. The thaw brought with it a new sense of life, not just in the budding tips of the prairie grass, but inside the small cabin. The routine they established was now one of a shared life. They ate their meals together at the small table. Silas had found a crate for Leo to sit on, and Alara had taken over the cooking, filling the cabin with the warm, forgotten smells of baking bread and simmering stew. The day came when their supplies ran low. Salt, flour, coffee, the staples of their existence needed replenishing. A trip to redemption was unavoidable. A knot of apprehension tightened in Alara's stomach at the thought of returning to that place, but it had to be done. This time, there was no question of her walking. Silas hitched the wagon, and they rode into town together, a silent, solitary man, a wary woman, and a small boy. They looked to all the world like a family. The town of Redemption had not changed. The same dust coated the buildings. The same hard-eyed men watched from the saloon porch. As they pulled up to the general store, whispers followed them like flies. Eyes followed Alara, filled with a mixture of curiosity and contempt. She kept her head high, her hand resting on Leo's shoulder, but she could feel the heat of their judgment. As Silas was inside the store, negotiating for supplies, a shadow fell over Alara and Leo, who were waiting by the wagon. She looked up into the cruel, satisfied face of Jedediah Thorne. He was flanked by the same enforcer who had grabbed her arm weeks before. "Well, well," Thorne sneered, his voice loud enough for the gathering crowd to hear. "Look what the wind blew back in. I thought you'd run for good. But you came back to me." Alara's blood ran cold. She pulled Leo behind her, shielding him with her body. "I have no business with you. My debt is paid." Thorne laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "The money is gone, but the contract remains. A contract for marriage. Still valid. You broke our agreement by running off. Now you're going to fulfill it." He took a step closer, his eyes glinting with a possessive fire. "You belong to me." The townsfolk, smelling a confrontation, drew closer, forming a circle around them. They were vultures eager for a spectacle. At that moment, the door of the general store swung open and Silas emerged, his arms full of sacks. He stopped dead, taking in the scene. His eyes, cold and hard as chips of flint, locked onto Thorne. He set the supplies carefully in the back of the wagon, his movements deliberate, betraying none of the cold fury that was rising in his chest. He stepped between Thorne and Alara, a solid, immovable wall. His hand did not go to the pistol at his hip, but it rested near it. His voice was dangerously quiet, a low rumble that cut through Thorne's bluster. "She owes you nothing. Leave her be. This is between me and my property." Thorne spat, emboldened by the crowd and his hired muscle. "It has nothing to do with you, recluse." Silas's gaze did not waver. "It has everything to do with me." He looked from Thorne's sneering face to the pale, frightened face of Alara. He saw Leo peeking out from behind her skirts, his small face a mirror of his mother's terror. In that instant, a choice was made. A lie was forged in the fire of protection. "By what right?" Thorne demanded, stepping forward aggressively. "By what right do you interfere?" Silas turned his head slightly, his eyes meeting Alara's over his shoulder. He saw the trust there, the desperate hope. It was all the permission he needed. He looked back at Thorn, his voice ringing out across the dusty street, clear and absolute. By the right of this house. The enforcer took a menacing step forward. Silas moved with a speed that belied his size. He reached into the wagon and his hand closed around the familiar stock of his rifle. He didn't raise it to his shoulder. He didn't aim it. He just held it, its long, dark barrel pointing toward the ground. The gesture was not a direct threat, but a statement of capability. It spoke of lines that would not be crossed. He met Thorn's gaze again, his own eyes burning with an intensity that made the other man flinch. "She is my wife." The words fell into a stunned silence. The crowd murmured. Alara gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. The lie was audacious, public, and binding. Thorn stared, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. He looked from Silas's unyielding stance, to the rifle held loosely in his hand, to the shocked faces of the townspeople. He was a bully, and bullies only understood strength. He had been publicly challenged and found wanting. "Ride on, Thorn," Silas said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, yet carrying the weight of a final judgment. "Before you find out what this land does to vermin." For a long moment no one moved. Then Thorn, his face mottled with rage and humiliation, gave a curt, angry nod to his man. He turned without another word and stormed toward the saloon. The show was over. The crowd, disappointed, began to disperse, casting curious, speculative glances at the man, the woman, and the child by the wagon. Silas had drawn a line in the dust of redemption, and no one dared to cross it. He had claimed her not as property, but as his own. The journey back to the homestead was wrapped in a new kind of silence. It was not the silence of mistrust or the comfortable quiet of routine. It was a silence born of shock, thick with the weight of the words that had been spoken in the town square. Alara sat stiffly on the wagon seat, her hands clenched in her lap. She kept stealing glances at Silas, who stared straight ahead, his jaw set, his knuckles white where he gripped the reins. The public lie he had told for her sake hung between them, a tangible, shimmering thing. When they finally arrived, the homestead looked different. The setting sun cast long shadows, painting the cabin and the barn in hues of gold and rose. It was no longer just a place of shelter. It was a sanctuary they had just fought to protect. It was the house he had claimed as his right. Silas pulled the wagon to a halt and dismounted. He moved to unhitch the horse, his movements still stiff and formal. He expected anger or fear, or a barrage of questions. He did not know what to say, how to explain the protective instinct that had made him utter such a monumental falsehood. He began to speak, his back still to her. "I'm sorry for. You saved us," she said, her voice soft but clear. He stopped, his hands frozen on the harness. He turned slowly to look at her. She was still sitting on the wagon, and there were tears shimmering in her eyes, but she was not crying. Her expression was one of profound, overwhelming gratitude. "Again," she added quietly, the tension that had held him rigid since town finally broke. He gave a short, jerky nod and went back to his work. That evening, the atmosphere inside the cabin was transformed. Alara cooked their meal, moving about the small space with a new sense of ownership. They ate together at the table, the silence between them now easy and peaceful. The lie had not created a wall. It had built a bridge. It had been a declaration not of ownership, but of alliance. Public vow of protection. After the meal, while Alara was washing the dishes, Leo, who had been quiet all day, found a piece of charcoal from the hearth and a flat, smooth piece of scrap wood from the kindling box. He sat on the floor near the fire, his small face scrunched in concentration. After a long while, he stood up and walked over to Silas, who was mending a piece of leather tack. He held out the piece of wood. Silas took it. On the surface, in the charmingly clumsy lines of a child, was a drawing. It was a picture of a large, square house with a curl of smoke coming from the chimney. Standing in front of it were three figures: a very tall man, a smaller woman with long hair, and a tiny boy standing between them. The most important detail was that all three figures were holding hands. Above them, a smiling sun took up a quarter of the drawing. Silas stared at the simple drawing for a long time. He saw not just a picture, but a child's interpretation of their reality. A home, family. He felt a powerful emotion swell in his chest, a feeling he had thought long dead and buried. It was a painful, beautiful ache of hope. He stood up, walked to the mantelpiece, and took down the small, carved bird. He held it in his palm for a moment, then set it gently on the table. He took a small nail from his toolkit and carefully tacked Leo's drawing to the wooden wall beside the hearth, right in the center, where the firelight would always fall on it. Alara had stopped her work to watch. When he turned back, their eyes met across the room. A complete, unspoken understanding passed between them. The lie had become a kind of truth. The house in the drawing was this cabin. The figures were them. From that moment on, the pretense fell away. They were no longer just a man, a woman, and a child occupying the same space. They were a family, forged not by law or contract, but by shared hardship, quiet acts of care, and a child's simple, hopeful drawing. From silence came warmth. From necessity came belonging. The seasons turned, rolling over the plains in a steady, inexorable rhythm. The harsh white of winter gave way to the tender green of spring, which deepened into the lush, sun-drenched gold of summer. The cabin, once a shelter for one man's solitary grief, had become a home for three souls who were quietly, patiently, healing together. They did not speak of love. The word was too grand, too fragile for the sturdy, practical life they were building. Instead, their affection was expressed in the language they had always known best: action. Love was in the way Silas found a small pair of half-worn boots at the general store and spent an evening carefully resoling them for Leo. It was in the way Alara noticed a tear in Silas's oldest work shirt and mended it with small, neat stitches that were nearly invisible. It was in the way they both paused in their work to watch Leo, now a sturdy, confident boy, chase grasshoppers through the tall summer grass, his laughter a bright, welcome sound that the wind carried across the fields. The homestead flourished under their combined efforts. The small patch of land Alara had cleared now boasted rows of hardy vegetables: potatoes, beans, and squash. The fences were strong, the barn was clean, and Silas had even acquired a milk cow, whose gentle lowing became a part of the morning's familiar sounds. They worked side by side, a comfortable, efficient team. He was the strength, she was the steady heart, and the boy was the joy that bound them together. The wooden rocker on the porch became the center of their evenings. After the day's work was done and Leo was asleep inside, they would sit together and watch the sun set, painting the vast sky with impossible colors. She would sit in the rocker, its gentle, rhythmic creaking a soft counterpoint to the chirping of the crickets. He would sit on the top step, his back against a post, cleaning a tool or simply watching the stars emerge one by one. They spoke more now, but their conversations were as spare and meaningful as the landscape around them. They talked of the weather, of the progress of the garden, of the new calf born in the spring. Sometimes she would tell him a story about Leo as a baby. Sometimes he would share a piece of farming wisdom his own father had taught him. They were mapping the edges of each other's lives, filling in the details slowly, carefully, with the respect of two people who understood the sanctity of sorrow. Silas found that the sharp edges of his grief had softened. The memory of Sarah and his first son was no longer a constant, open wound. It had become a part of him, a quiet, bittersweet ache that reminded him not just of what he had lost, but of his capacity to love. He could look at the child's drawing tacked to the wall and feel not a betrayal of his past, but a continuation of it. He was building again, not to replace what was gone, but to honor it by living, by protecting, by caring. He had not just saved Alara and Leo from the harshness of the world. They had saved him from the prison of his own past. They had walked into his silence and filled it with the quiet, unassuming sounds of life. The carved bird still sat on the mantelpiece, its wings forever poised for flight. But now it did not seem so lonely. It was a part of the story, a testament to a love that had been, which made possible the new, quiet love that was growing, day by day, in the heart of the vast, empty plains. The home was built. It was strong. It was real. The cycle of the seasons came around again. The vibrant green of summer faded to the muted gold of autumn, and a familiar chill returned to the morning air. A year had passed since Alara and Leo had arrived, their shadows long and desperate behind them. Now their roots were deep in the rich soil of the homestead. One evening, Silas came in from the barn, the scent of cold air and hay clinging to him. He stamped the mud from his boots and hung his heavy canvas coat on the hook by the door. It was the same hook it always hung on, but tonight he saw it with fresh eyes. It was no longer just his coat. It was a fixture, a part of the landscape of their home, as familiar and constant as the hearth or the table. The cabin was warm and filled with the soft glow of lamplight. Leo, worn out from a day of helping his mother harvest the last of the potatoes, was already fast asleep in the big cot, which was now permanently pushed against the far wall. His breathing was deep and even. He was home. Alara sat at the table, her head bent over her work. She was mending one of Leo's shirts, her needle flashing in the lamplight. A basket of vegetables from her garden sat on the floor beside her, a testament to her labor and the land's generosity. She looked up as Silas entered, a small, welcoming smile touching her lips. It was a smile he had come to know well, one that held no fear or suspicion, only a quiet, steady warmth. He didn't speak. He walked over to the hearth and held his hands out to the fire, chasing the chill from his fingers. His gaze fell on the child's drawing tacked to the wall. The charcoal lines were faded now, smudged by a year of life in the cabin, but the image it depicted, the house, the sun, the three figures holding hands, had never been clearer, never felt more true. He turned from the fire and walked to the table where she sat. He stood behind her for a moment, simply watching her hands as she worked the needle through the cloth. He saw the strength and the care in her fingers. He saw the life they had built together in that simple domestic act. She paused in her sewing, as if sensing the weight of his gaze. She did not turn to look at him. Instead, she reached a hand up and back, her fingers searching for his. Her hand, small and warm, found his much larger one where it rested on his side. She covered his rough, calloused hand with her own, her touch a silent, definitive statement. It was not a question. It was an answer, an acceptance, a vow. She held his hand there, a simple, profound gesture that spoke of permanence, of peace, of a love that had finally found its voice not in words, but in a quiet, certain touch. The fire crackled, the boy slept, and the silence was finally, truly, peaceful. She stayed.